Hola, I'm Dr. Marty Harris, and this lecture is an historical overview of diversity in public school education in the USA. This lecture is based in part on a wonderful book and PBS documentary entitled School, the Story of American Public Education. Let's begin by examining the bilingual education debate. It's not new in the U.S. and certainly not new to schools. There are three core issues within the bilingual debate. First, what does U.S. citizenship mean? Second, to what degree should a person assimilate the new culture? Should they discard their language and cultural roots? Should they adopt the majority culture and its language? Third, which paradigm should society adopt and schools incorporate? Pluralist or acculturation? Is it the school's mission to promote a common language and common national identity? Does society as a whole benefit from cultural and linguistic diversity? Let's look back historically and examine the U.S. schools in the 1800s. Across our nation, Native Americans were forced to assimilate. These pictures show government schools for Native American schools in Pennsylvania and Utah. Separate but unequal were the norm for Native Americans and African Americans. Bilingual schools before the early 1900s were common. These included schools that taught English and another language, such as German, French, Spanish, Dutch, Polish, Norwegian, Czech, and Native American languages. In the 1800s, the Cherokees established and operated an educational system with 21 schools. Their 1,100 students had a 90% literacy rate in their native language. The Cherokee bilingual schools used bilingual materials to such an extent that by 1852, Oklahoma Cherokees had a higher English literacy level than the white population of either Texas or Arkansas. Let's look at U.S. schools in the 1900s. They were particularly challenged to assimilate European immigrants flooding America. In 1923, English-only laws were adopted by 34 out of 48 states. Soon, English-only debate reached the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court ruled that a state's interest in fostering a homogeneous people with American ideals was not an adequate justification for outlawing foreign language instruction in public schools. The Supreme Court struck down territorial legislation in Hawaii that regulated the island's private foreign schools. Until the 1960s, most Hispanic students attended segregated schools. Students were punished for speaking their native language at school. In several states, it was against the law to teach the lower grades in any language but English. Legal supports for English language learners in the public school. These rights can be traced back to the civil rights movement and, of course, our Constitution. Today, education is a principal instrument in awakening the child to cultural values, in preparing him for later professional training, and in helping him to adjust normally to his environment. In these days, it is doubtful that any child may reasonably be expected to succeed in life if he is denied the opportunity of an education. This was the ruling that came out of the 1954 landmark case, Brown versus the Board of Education in Topeka. For years, our nation struggled with desegregation, focusing on African Americans. It took a teacher to make things happen for other disadvantaged students. What happened? The Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965. This photo includes President Lyndon B. Johnson signing the U.S.A. in 1965, with his Texas grade school teacher looking on. U.S.A. was the first powerful federal law to invest funding in American education with specific components addressing the needs of disadvantaged students. Funding was provided for the education of students from low economic households and for students with disabilities. Let's look at the Bilingual Education Acts of 68, 74, 84, and 94. Known as Title VII of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, it originally provided supplemental funding for school districts interested in establishing programs to meet the special education needs of large numbers of children with limited English language skills. In 1970, the Department of Housing, Education and Welfare, HEW, interpreted Title VII regulations to mean schools could not deny students with limited English proficiency access to educational programs. Equal Education Opportunities Act, EEA, of 1974. 1. It required school districts to establish language programs and eliminate language barriers in school. 2. It provided definitions of what constituted denial of equal educational opportunity. Lau versus Nichols in 1974 is an extremely important U.S. Supreme Court decision. English language programs in schools were established by federal laws and strengthened by several landmark litigations. This is a landmark litigation. The Supreme Court decision included this statement: there is no equity of treatment by providing students with the same facilities, textbooks, teachers, and curriculum for students who do not understand English are effectively foreclosed from any meaningful education. It continued with, basic English skills are at the very core of what public schools teach, requiring that before a child can effectively participate in educational programs, he must already have acquired those basic skills, is to make a mockery of public education. Referred to as the Lau remedies, in 1975, HEW established basic guidelines for schools with students with limited English proficiency, LEP. Civil Rights Language Minority Regulations of 1980. First, it established 4 basic components for bilingual instruction: identification, assessment, services, and exit. Required that bilingual instruction be taught by qualified teachers. Castaneda versus Pickard was a landmark case in 1981. It required that appropriate action to overcome language barriers be taken through well-implemented programs. It set standards for the courts to be able to examine LEP programs. This included 1. Pedagogically sound plan for the LEP students. 2. Sufficient qualified staff to implement the plan. And 3. A system established to evaluate the program. It did not require bilingual programs to meet these standards. It only set the standards. Iowa versus the Migrant Council in 1981 established the legal responsibility of the state's Department of Education to monitor implementation of the LEP programs. Illinois versus Gomez, 1987. This gave the states the responsibility for establishing and enforcing minimum requirements for the implementation of a language remediation program, requirements for the redesignation of students with LEP to Fluent English Proficient, FEP status. Plyer versus Doe in 1982. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the 14th Amendment prohibits states from denying a free public education to undocumented immigrant children, regardless of their immigrant status. Obviously, no child is responsible for his birth, and penalizing the child is an ineffective as well as unjust way of deterring the parent. What a powerful quote from this ruling. Educational reform is based upon educational research. In 1983, the National Commission on Excellence in Education reported to President Ronald Reagan their report called A Nation at Risk. It presented evidence that the schools were not doing enough to ensure the success of all students. Schools were failing our nation, and therefore our nation was at risk. This report launched the 20th century wave of school reform. Goals 2000. This was passed in 1989. It set important goals for our nation's school, but it did not authorize programs or make funding available. It just set the goals. Have we reached these goals yet? What Goals 2000 did accomplish was the groundwork for No Child Left Behind Act, which was passed in 2002. President George W. Bush summarized the national problem. Too many Americans are segregated by low expectations, illiteracy, and self-doubt. There are 4 pillars to No Child Left Behind Act. Nickleby. Stronger accountability for results. It holds schools accountable for the success of all students and ELLs, English Language Learners. More freedom for states and communities. Proven educational methods. It holds schools and teachers responsible for using effective strategies to teach all students. More choices for parents. It empowers parents to choose a different school. Number 1. Reading proficiency increased by 3 percentage points. 2. Mathematics proficiency increased by 11 percentage points. 3. The black-white achievement gap in reading narrowed by 4 percentage points. 4. The black-white achievement gaps in mathematics narrowed by 5 percentage points. 5. The Hispanic white achievement gap in reading narrowed by 4 percentage points. 6. The Hispanic white achievement gap in mathematics narrowed by 7 percentage points. Between Texas and Arizona, on a forgotten road in a forgotten town, stands a rock schoolhouse. In the afternoon sun and the desert wind, you can almost hear the children at recess. Were these children forgotten and left behind? Have we forgotten the important lesson that education and opportunity and success are intertwined? How far can one child go given the opportunity for a quality education? Here is Supreme Court Justice Sonia Sotomayor. She rose from humble roots in the Bronx, New York, housing project to become the 111th Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. She is the third woman to serve on the highest court in our land and the first Hispanic American. She is of Puerto Rican descent. So now, today, the question is, are you ready to teach in today's classrooms? Are you ready to teach all students? Are you ready to honor diversity in your classroom? What do you need to know to ensure the success of all students? This lecture gave you an historical perspective on U.S. schools and English language learners. The next lecture, What's Different About Today's Classrooms?, will build your knowledge concerning diversity in your classroom. Remember, education should be special. Thanks for listening.